toi qui passera le faire.
Oui, c'est bien. Non, mais c'est ça comme ça.
Ouais.
Route, et ensuite
Route, et donc du coup, comme il y a que trois et les quatre, c'est Nicolas avec la chaîne. Tiens.
Je travaille avec Stéphane.
Bonjour, Vanessa Hazard, et merci d'avoir accepté.
Good morning. So it's 10. We're going to start. I'm pleased to welcome you here in the Green Bubble. I'm Stéphane Baudet. I'm a director in a KPMG France Center of Excellence and Nature and Biodiversity lead for France in KPMG. So welcome to this roundtable on supply chains and deforestation. As you know, globalization is today no more a straight line. You see, like every day in the news, some turmoils in global trade, from conflicts, from environmental crisis that makes transparency and control over the supply chain a vital stake for today firms. The supply chains are under scrutiny more and more for different reasons. First, we have a steady rise of public attention, of controversies, of media coverage over environmental and human rights violation across the supply chains. We have very often articles about deforestation in countries like Brazil, about forced labor of Uyghur in China, etc., and it drives more and more attention of customers who are more and more tooled to scrutinize their purchases with simple applications in their mobile phones. All these turmoils in the global supply chains makes higher volatility in prices and in the availability of supplies due to geopolitical tensions and also due to environmental risks like water scarcity, droughts, floodings, extreme weather events. So availability, steadiness of prices is no more taken for granted. There is also an increasing pressure from regulations. Two examples that are recent. First, the European regulation against deforestation and forest degradation that we will deep dive into this morning. And second, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that has been very recently adopted in the European Union. So all of this makes a sine qua non conditions for firms to make a wide range of products available on the European markets, guaranteeing that these products are free from environmental and human rights violation. It is no more a CSO question. It is a question of resilience of the businesses. So supply chains bear now increasing legal, financial, operational, and reputational risks. And this makes a clear business case for better knowledge and better control over the whole supply chains for firms. Not only risks, there are also a huge wealth of opportunities for firms to turn from short-term cost-scaling logics towards longer-term logics of value creation. A few examples of securing critical supplies and making business resilient, ensuring the quality and regularity of the inputs for productions. It is a key factor of decarbonization. As you know, the carbon footprint is massively in the scope 3, that is in the supply chain, rather than scope 1 and 2. It is even more true for biodiversity, and with biodiversity impacts that are concentrated on the raw materials. And also, more than reducing biodiversity impacts, firms are now turning more and more in positive impacts in regenerative practices, and this also requires to work with the whole supply chain. So addressing these risks of opportunities require, of course, harnessing the power of data, the power of digital tools to improve transparency, to develop robust proofs that the products are not harmful, but beyond digital, beyond data, it also is a human adventure. And improving the transparency, the reliability of supply chains until changes in the culture, in the ways of works of procurement departments across firms. They now deepen their relationships with suppliers who become essential partners in the firm's journey towards sustainability. This change is not going from one day to another. It is a midterm change. It needs time to develop supplier dialogue. It needs time to support suppliers in their adaptation to new requirements in order to avoid too simple exclusion approaches that can have adverse effects on the regularity on the supply chain and also on the environment. If at the end of the day, what you do entails that you are pairing the worst producers with the worst buyers, I don't know if the forest would be better off at the end of the day. Internally, this requires also cooperation inside the companies. Cooperation between procurement, cooperation between procurement operations and the CSR department. And to illustrate now how supply chain have become a front line for company sustainability, we cannot address all supply chains issues in this amount of time. We propose you to now deep dive into one of today's hardest challenges, that is the fight against deforestation. And for this, I have the pleasure today of welcoming 3 speakers. On my left, Nicolas Mounard, who is Vice President, Sustainability, ESG and Traceability at Barry Cable Chocolates, and he is also an ex-CEO of sustainable brand Alter Eco, former also Chief Executive of Farm Africa NGO. Just beside of him is Marianne Sabel, who is Manager, Sensitive Supplies and Due Diligence at Carrefour. And on the left, last but not least, Ruth Guerra, who is my colleague partner at KPMG Avocat, trade specialist and head of KPMG's International Climate and Nature Regulatory Hub. So, Ruth, the floor is yours. Can you explain us what are the key challenges that the recent European regulation against deforestation poses to our clients? Ruth, it's up to you.
Thank you, Stefan. Can you maybe just look on the slide? Stefan, thank you. As you were saying, the European regulation against deforestation and forest degradation will have a huge impact on all the supply chain. I will just go through this slide to give you a global overview about this regulation. So, let's start from the beginning. This regulation is in force since June last year and will be implemented in December of this year. It covers 7 specific products based on the tariff code, on the customs classification of the product, and some derivatives. So it covers cocoa, coffee, soy, palm oil, wood, rubber, and cattle, and some derivative product from this product. The way it works is theoretically quite easy, but it's a huge impact on traceability and collection of data for the companies. The aim of this regulation is to ensure that it is prohibited to import, sell, or export one of these products or the derivative without ensuring that they are not produced on land that has been deforested or degraded with a cutoff date by end of 2020. This is the cutoff date. So first thing to be able to ensure and to demonstrate is that the product or its derivative doesn't come from deforestation. Second thing is that they have been produced in accordance with the local regulation. The local regulation has really an extensive interpretation. It concerns the local environmental regulation, the labor law, the taxation, the forest management, for example. And this also needs to be collected. And these two criteria needs to be demonstrated on a due diligence statement that needs to be done, whether by the importer, the seller, or the exporter. Okay? This due diligence will need to be quoted in a register, and it will receive a number. Let's say it quite simple. This number will need to be quoted on the customs declaration for import and for export. Without this due diligence number, product will not be able to enter or be exported from Europe. But it has also a huge impact for all the local producer and purchasers in Europe, because it's not just import and export. There is a large interpretation of the name of operator. So that means that in any step of the supply chain, they need to check whether the supplier had already made this due diligence. In this case, they just need to check whether they consider that it's enough to ensure that there is no risk to use product that is issued from deforestation. And when the operator is the first entity that is making the release for consumption in Europe, this is the one that needs to have the full traceability. The level of information to be collected and to be demonstrated will depend on the level of the risk of the countries. For the first year, all the countries will have the same range of risk. After 2025, there will be a list of risk countries, high risk, medium risk, and low risk. What is important to have in mind is that whatever is the risk of the country of origin of the product, the diligence will need to be performed. And whatever is the stage of the stakeholder, whether it's an entity that is importing or whether it's just a trader, the check of the due diligence will need to be performed. It's just the level that will depend on the high risk or low risk of the country of origin. Another important thing to have in mind is that there is an obligation for member states to make audits. That will be, the average of the audit will depend on the risk of the country of origin. For example, for high risk country of origin, there is a 9% average of controls compulsory to be made by each member state. In France, is the agricultural ministry and the environmental ministry that has the competency to make these controls. Because the aim, as I was saying, of this regulation is not just to make the compliance due diligence, is to ensure that the compliance due diligence will result to avoid deforestation and to change the strategy also from a purchase point of view. And last thing that I wanted to raise is the fact that there is penalties that have been adopted on the regulation. It can be confiscation of the product, confiscation also of the revenue of the product, and it can go to fines that at least 4% of the net turnover of the company in Europe. And another important thing for this regulation is that it accepts to have third-party compliance against the regulation. So any ONG that wants to fight against behavior that do not consider as coherent with the regulation, sorry, they can introduce claims, and they will be published at the level of the European Union. So this, when we read it, it seems quite simple, but when we apply it to the reality, the fact is that we have 7 products and the derivative, but it has a huge implication on different type of industry that we even do not think that they can contribute to deforestation. For example, on the automotive sector, because there is rubber, or on textile, because they are leather, or even in newspapers, because papers and books printed are also on the scope. So there is a huge impact and challenge for the operators to be able to collect all this data that they need to be able to be compliant and also to provide this information to their own clients.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for shedding clarity over this quite complex regulation. Basically, it's a game changer because it sets for companies nearly an obligation of results, not only an obligation of means. So I wonder how companies implement this in practice and what are the challenges they are confronted with. And for this, our two other speakers will present how they address, from their position in the supply chain, all these requirements. So we'll begin with Marianne. How does Carrefour work with its suppliers to be compliant in a few months now?
Thank you very much, Stéphane, for this introduction. So I'm Marianne Sabel. I'm a CSR manager in charge of sustainable raw material at Carrefour. And as Ruth said, we have more than we have 7 commodities in the EUDR. And I would like to illustrate concretely what it means for Carrefour. When you enter a store in Carrefour, you go to the non-food sector first, and you will find the clothes, for example, made with viscose. Then you go to, you will find also table made with, tropical wood, which was in fact one of the first risks that we saw in Carrefour. You can find books with paper. And then you go to grocery section. You will find cocoa. You will find cookies that contains palm oil. And then you can go to fresh product and you will find chicken. Chicken that was fed with soy. And you can see that we have lots of products that need to be in compliance with the new EUDR. And in France, for example, it's more than 20,000 products that we need to comply, just in France. And we are in 8 countries. So imagine the work that it needs to be for us. We have a variety of commodity with different level of complexity. For example, soy is not in our direct supply chain, so it's more difficult for us than paper, which is a less processed product. We have a variety of suppliers. We have industrial supplier, we have agriculture, we have small company, big company with resources, different resources. We have commodities coming from different countries. For example, we are very huge in Brazil. We have lots of stores in Brazil in Carrefour, and Brazilian beef is one of the risky raw material. So the challenge is colossal for us, and our job is to find solution for each product, each raw material. So how we do it? In 2020, our CEO Alexandre Bompard joined the coalition CGF coalition on forest as a lead, as a co-lead. And all together with other retailers and with other manufacturers, we work all together to establish standards such as certification. For example, on palm oil, we have the certification RSPO, Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil, and we have the objective to be in compliance with 100% of our palm oil in our supply chain. We also use a program or private certification. And all these rules are in a document which is called purchasing rules, and all our buyers in Carrefour are trained to know the rules, to understand it, and to apply it. And we also need to team up with retailers and manufacturers to set up standards. We work with everyone within pre-competitive meetings. So I talk about CGF, but we also have working groups such as IFCD, Initiative Française pour un cacao durable, the French initiative on sustainable cocoa. What we don't want is to stay in this logic of certification. Why? Because it doesn't change the markets. So what we want now is to favor those, the traders, leading market transformation. This is why we have a commitment, which is 100% of traders that we are working with, evaluated and in progress by 2025. The traders need to show us progress so that we all together comply with the regulation. And in case of alert from external stakeholders, because no tools is perfect, the commitment that we have is to be perfectly transparent. We disclosed a transparency platform on forest last year, where we have all the alerts and the action plan associated regarding forests. And if we have an alert from an NGO, we always respond and disclose everything.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And now at the next step of the supply chain, Nicolas, how are you answering the raising of expectations and requirements from your clients?
So for me, EUDR is something that makes me completely schizophrenic. I think it's a extraordinary regulation, but it's also a nightmare to implement, particularly for us. So just a bit of context for Barry Callebaut, we source about 1 million tons of beans, and we are vertically integrated, so we transform into chocolate for the industry. We basically source 20 to 25% of the worldwide crop, so it's a huge asset for us. And EUDR, in terms of implementation, is already a nightmare, but in the moment we are going through a very specific and very exceptional context, where basically cocoa beans has been traded between 2,000 and 3,000 tons over the last 15, 20 years. And at the moment, it's traded at $10,000 per ton. So completely crazy, mainly driven by a big reduction of the crop, 40% between Ivory Coast and Ghana, so quite exceptional. So basically, as a practice, we're squeezed between two tensions. We're squeezed between a sourcing team that can't find beans, very difficult to find beans at the moment, and between farmers that we need to convince that they shouldn't deforest, which in some cases they are legally authorized to do, to plant some cocoa that they can sell at $10,000 per ton. So quite a tension. Just a bit of context also on deforestation. If you look at the expansion of cocoa over the last 50, 60 years, 50 to 60% of the expansion has been done on the back of deforestation. So quite radical. And if you take a country like Ivory Coast, which still provides 40% of the worldwide crop, there's no more forest left in Ivory Coast. So you have 9% of the territory in Ivory Coast, which is under forest. And just for you to get a benchmark, like a country like France would be at 35%, US would be at 33%, Germany at 32%. So basically, there's no forest left in Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast over the last 15, 20 years has moved from producing 1.4 million tons to now producing 2.2 million tons. No increase of yield. So it has all been done on the back of transformation of forest to agricultural land. So quite extraordinary. For me, over the last 20 years, it's probably the most transformational project I've been working on. Also because it corresponds to my own vision of sustainability, which I think is a fight, is a tension. So in the implementation of EUDR, we need to be relatively comfortable with a certain degree of conflict and rapport de force, because we're really talking about the essence of what the company is doing, which is transforming the way we buy beans and the way we procure. I want to illustrate that by the three principles of the law. So basically, in order to be compliant, you need to achieve three things: traceability, principle of legality. So Ruth has mentioned that we need to, seems obvious to most of you, but we need to source beans that have been produced in accordance with local law. And then cut-off date. So we need to guarantee that there is no deforestation associated with the beans after 31st of December 2020. The three principles are quite straightforward to understand. Actually, if you want to read the law, it reads very easily. I would encourage you to do that. If I start with traceability, same thing, seems to be a given, but we're talking about physical traceability. So we need, just to give you a sense, in 6 months we need to press a button, and on every batch of chocolate we need to give a list of plots and a list of farmers. And we need to do that instantaneously. And if you look at the way sustainability has grown over the last 20 or 30 years, it has grown on the concept of mass balance, which is basically a disaggregation between sustainability on one side and the business on the other side. So until now, when you buy a Rainforest Alliance tea or Rainforest Alliance chocolate, the sustainability project is implemented with a community that can produce 10 or 20,000 tons of product, but the product is produced with other beans. So you have the sustainability on one side, the beans on the other side. The idea was not to disrupt the way the products are produced. So you want, as a factory, you want to keep running your factory. You don't want to have to stop the line. You don't want to have to segregate the product. You don't want to have to clean the line. So until now, you had sustainability on one side and you had the business on the other side. EUDR is a radical transformation because you need to provide physical traceability. So you need to recreate that link between sustainability on one side and the business on the other side. So the consequence on a business like us is extraordinary because you need to rethink your factory, you need to rethink your lines, you need to invest CapEx, you need to add silos, you need to obviously adjust your system. So the sheer essence of the regulation that says you need to provide physical traceability to the product is already in itself a revolution, really. And applying that on a crop that is 90–95% driven by smallholder farmers in the bush is also very different than applying that on wheat or dairy in Europe. So you have a massive challenge on traceability. The second challenge is the principle of legality. Same thing that seems quite obvious to you, but we will be obliged to respect the law of the country of production. And when it applies to cocoa, it's very challenging also. So particularly when it comes to protected area. So if you take, again, a country like Ivory Coast, it's estimated that 20–30% of the crop in Ivory Coast, biggest producer in the world, comes from protected area. So from national park, from classified forest. So again, imagine the squeeze in terms of volumes. We basically have to, as an industry, stop sourcing from protected area, which represent 30% of the biggest producing country. Extremely complicated. Again, keep in mind the context of the market. We can expect a double squeeze. So we have a squeeze at the moment with a lower level of volume. We have a squeeze coming next year with basically a reduction of the pool of beans we can source, simply by the fact that a lot of plots are within protected area. What are we going to do about that? So you have two aspects. You have an aspect of due diligence, and you have an aspect of mitigation. Due diligence, same thing, a monster. So we need to consolidate all the polygons from all the plots. We source 1 million tons of beans. That probably comes from 2 million farmers. So we need to provide GPS coordinates about the boundary of all the plots. And then we need to analyze these polygons. So we need to analyze the overlaps of the polygons with protected area, which same thing, ask a lot of questions in terms of maps, for example. It's very complicated in a country like DRC, like Congo, or like Cameroon, to have very accurate maps of where the protected area are. So we need to consolidate polygons, we need to analyze overlaps, and we need to obviously discard and eliminate some polygons from our database. So that's for the due diligence element. On the mitigation element, the extraordinary things of EUDR for us is like it gives us a window to mainstream forest conservation in the business. To be honest, until now, there was not necessarily a, I hate the term, but a business case for forest conservation for a company like Barry Callebaut. Now there is, because basically the one article of the regulation obliges us to mitigate the risk of deforestation. And the best way of mitigating the risk of deforestation is not to deforest, so to encourage conservation. When it comes to principle of legality, because we're talking about protected area, the forest conservation that we're going to mainstream is going to be around engaging with government. This protected area falls under usually a governmental agency that are in charge of national parks or protected area. So same thing, it will force us to do things that we are not necessarily very used to do, which is working with government and strengthening the capacity of agencies that are usually understaffed and under-resourced to basically just implement basic forest protection for places that are legally protected. And then the third principle is the cutoff date, extremely challenging, because here you're not talking about a principle of legality, you're basically talking about convincing a farmer not to deforest, which is a right he or she has legally. He or she will not be authorized to deforest, or we can deforest, will just not be authorized to deforest, replant cocoa, and export to the EU. Quite a challenge when you talk about $10,000 a ton. You basically need to convince farmers to voluntarily not deforest. So for us, same thing, same approach, an approach of due diligence, an approach of mitigation. On the due diligence, it's basically analyzing the presence of forest on polygons. Same thing if you take a country like Cameroon, which has 55% of the territory under forest. We identify forest on roughly 70 or 80% of our polygons. Okay? So on 70 or 80% of the plots we are sourcing from, you have a forest as per the definition of EUDR. So huge risk for us, obviously. So we need to analyze presence of forest on polygons, and then we need to analyze deforestation alerts. So we have satellite software that basically ring an alarm every time you have an event of deforestation. Keep in mind that the granularity of this alert is also very, very strong. So making the difference between someone who is pruning a tree and someone who is cutting a tree is a challenge. So a big question that we have at the moment is how many people will have to deploy on the ground to check physically the alerts. So quite a challenge. So due diligence, analysis of presence of forest on plots, check of alerts, and then mitigation, also an effort of conservation, but obviously a very different approach. In the principle of legality, you need to work with government and strengthening the capacity of agencies. Here, it's an individual approach. Again, you need to convince individual farmer not to do something that legally they can do, and you need to compensate them not to do that. So probably something a lot more similar to what we're doing in terms of agroforestry, where we basically need to put in place mechanisms like payment for ecosystem services, so cash transfer, cash premium, to basically retribute farmers not to do something. So again, in terms of developmental approach, something very different, a very institutional approach on the principle of legality, probably very Ivory Coast driven, and something very individualized and very community driven on the principle of cutoff date. So yeah, I mean, a huge and fabulous experience, a lot of tension with my friends of sourcing at the moment, but yeah, super exciting.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Just one question for you and for Marianne to launch the question and answers. There are several regulations, several angles, environmental angle, human rights angle that apply on the same supply chain. So how do you cope with these different approaches, different angles when you talk with your suppliers?
I mean, first of all, I believe in the rule of law. We push for regulation, and I can tell you that in the example of EUDR, what EUDR has made us do as an industry over the last 12 months versus what we haven't done over the last 20 years is quite extraordinary. So the reaction it has triggered in terms of like completely transforming the business, etc., is extraordinary. So at least from a sustainability practice, I think regulation makes our life much easier. Basically, we have no choice. So yeah, I mean, for me, I see really the duo of EUDR on one side addressing deforestation and CSDDD on one side, on the other side addressing human rights and creating some kind of level playing field for the industry. Just for the small story, just to give you a sense of anecdote. We published last week our sourcing policy for EUDR to, so basically the criteria that we're going to use to assess polygons, to assess suppliers, to assess country. feedback from our head of sourcing was a one-liner saying, when you develop that, have you thought about us filling the factories? So we say, yeah, we did, but we also thought about complying with the law.
Yes, I agree with you. The legislation will help us a lot. And I think we need to work all together with the traders, with all the suppliers, because not everyone knows well the legislation. And as the tool to do it, it's a lot of data collection also. So I think it would be one of our main challenge as a retailer.
Thank you. And we are now open for a question and answers from the room.
Hi, Julien Chupin. I am an independent consultant. A question for Nicolas. So in Côte d'Ivoire, there are maybe 10 to 20 companies doing the same thing as you are, looking at GIS, the plots, analyzing the risk. The transaction cost is massive. You're all doing it with maybe 10 to 20 competitors, plus your clients are doing it. So the amount of money going into compliance is massive. Are there any initiatives to engage with competitors, partners, clients, and with local governments or governments to have landscape regulations? Because as you were saying, at the end, you could also transfer this system to local government. We know it's difficult, it's expensive, but if they have the capacity of doing that, then you just need to show that there is a good regulation that is taking care of what all your companies are doing at. So I know it's very difficult to engage with competitors and local government, but here there might be an opportunity cost for doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, so a couple of things on this. First, on the traceability side, both countries, so Ghana and Ivory Coast, represent 60% of the worldwide production. So that's where the game is. Both are developing national traceability system, which is a big step forward. So obliging us also to submit and to transfer our database of polygons to them. So them taking ownership of traceability system, extremely important. Then it's going to be a bit of a challenge for us, because at the end of the day, as Ruth was explaining, the liability is on us. So we cannot completely hand over our traceability system to government. We need to basically mirror them. But strong initiatives both in Ghana and Ivory Coast of developing national traceability system. Then in terms of collaboration with the industry on cocoa, so basically in the regulation you have 3 key articles. You have Article 9, which which is about data collection. You have Article 10, which is risk assessment. And then you have Article 11, which is risk mitigation. In the cocoa industry, typically the European Cocoa Association, which basically gather the 10 companies you're talking about, we've developed protocols jointly about the 3 articles. But then same thing, you also need to keep a bit your unique selling point. For us, typically, I'm not sure that the whole industry is going to mainstream forest conservation as a mitigation strategy. So for us, we're going to say basically the way to mitigate deforestation is to invest massively in conservation. So we're planning to invest 6 to 10 million per year. I would hope. No, it's the wrong term. I don't think our competitors are going to do the same thing. So you have a level of level playing field for sure. You have collaboration with government, particularly on traceability, and then you have some positioning, because basically the law doesn't tell you what mitigation is, doesn't tell you the risk assessment. You're free to define your own methodology. So yeah, basically there will be a bit of our own approach in there, but there's a higher level of collaboration. Maybe just giving you a last fun example also on that. Basically, when you talk about traceability, you have 2 things to put in place. You have one thing which is identifying the plot, but you have one thing which is making sure that you don't source from that plot more than what that plot is supposed to produce. So we have something that we call yield control, where we cap the volumes that we buy from a specific plot. But okay, basically because a cooperative will not sell 80% of their cocoa to us, you also need to have control over what they're selling to others if you want your yield control to be effective, basically. So we'll be forced to share data for sure.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Hi, Bérangère Papin from Aramet. I was wondering, could you explain how you work with communities on the field, Nicolas, with this new regulation, and how do you, which intermediaries or which NGOs or organizations you work with to help producers adapt? And also, has it brought about initiatives for agroforestry development on the field?
So I'll start with the second question. We do a lot of agroforestry, but it's a bit irrelevant for the regulation because obviously it's already farmed. So that's also something people do not necessarily understand, but what matters for the regulation is the use of the land use. So if the land is already farmed and was already farmed pre-31st of December, even if 2020, even if you have a high level of canopy and a high level of tree cover, it doesn't matter. What qualifies the status of a forest is the land use. So if the land was already farmed, irrespective of the amount of cover you have on the farm, it qualifies as compliant. So agroforestry will not really matter on that front. And then how we work with community, it depends on country. So Ivory Coast has a big tradition of cooperatives, so that creates for us a vehicle to implement what we want to do. So typically when we talk about forest conservation, there will probably be two stakeholders. We'll work a lot with the agency in charge of national park and the agency in charge of classified forest. And then we'll work with the cooperatives as the vehicle to implement community-based activity. Ghana, very different. You don't have too much cooperatives, so it's really farmers delivering to middleman delivering to us. So I would assume that in Ghana we'll have to work a lot more with the Forest Commission, for example. But we don't have the ability to have a collective body as a cooperative that make things easier in terms of implementation. But it's large-scale operation. Just in Ivory Coast, we have 1,000 people working on sustainability. So we have a lot of people, boots on the ground. And NGOs, yes, probably on forest conservation will work. So typically in Ivory Coast, Forêt Cavally, which is a very famous protected area, we work a lot with Earthworm Foundation, former Forest Trust. So yeah, we'll work also with NGOs for sure.
We still have the time to take one or two short questions. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. Daria Karlenko from Sustainalytics. I have also a question to Nicolas. You were mentioning you cannot harvest anymore from protected areas. How this related to the regulation? You mean like new plantations in these areas?
Yes, massive. Some of them are actually legal, some of them are illegal. So if you go in Cameroon or Ghana, you have a lot of enclaves within protected area. But same thing, just to give you a sense of the level of complexity that we have to deal with. Typically, the enclaves in protected area in Ghana, they are not well documented by the Ministry of Agriculture. So it's very difficult for us to have a database of the legal farms within protected area. So first you need to have a good map of protected area. You need to have a good map of forest map in 2020. And then you need to capture enclaves in protected area where you might be authorized to source from. But most of the farm in protected area are illegal. So if you go in a national park in Ivory Coast, you have all the forests are mainly in the western side, so towards the Liberia border. Yeah, it's highly farmed, and same thing like it's not very funny, but so you have 75% of the cocoa produced in protected area in Ivory Coast that comes from forêt classée 3, so classified forest 3, which are already 75% degraded. The answer of the government of Ivory Coast was to say, well, then let's declassify the forest, which they have, which basically they've requalified their forêt classée 3 as agroforestry. And they've basically, they've dealt with the principle of legality by saying, okay, we have a big problem with a protected area, let's declassify a protected area, and then we're fine.
And we have like 1 or 2 minutes before the cut-off time, so we can take one question. There is the lady with orange vest. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Émilie Miège from EcoAct. I think it's a question for Nicolas and Marianne as well. You were mentioning reduction of volume that you will be able to source in the future. Does this mean that there will be tension on the supply of non-deforesting cocoa, and how are you going to cope with those tensions?
So I was telling Mariam that like 15 years ago, I had some very tense negotiation with Carrefour when I was at Alterico. So I think to answer your question, I think negotiations with Carrefour will be harder, for sure. So yeah, there will be a squeeze of volume. I think the way we see it is you might have a two-tier market with Europe and the rest of the world, because obviously they will also have some very cynical somehow move where you might also reshift some of your flow towards Asia or US, for example, and concentrate your clean supply chain for Europe. But it comes at a cost. So at the moment, you can also imagine the tension for us. We have to pass price increase to the likes of Nestlé, Mondelez, Unilever, when the market has quadrupled in 12 months. And we also have to tell them, hey, by the way, UDR is coming in 6 months and it's going to cost money. So it's going to be very, very complicated, for sure.
So thank you very much.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And yes, we don't want products with deforestation going to Asia, for example. It's not what we want also. That's why we want to favor traders with good practices in the world market, and it can be financial help also. For example, in Brazil, we have a fund of 10 million euros to help with projects on agroforestation. So this fund could be here to help also with the legislation.
Thank you very much. I don't want to abuse our time, and for courtesy for the next speakers, we will end the roundtables now. But we will be just there to answer the next questions if you have some. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Ruth.